The moment my stepfather called me worthless in front of the courtroom, I thought my life had already reached its lowest point. But what happened next was something no one in that room, not even the judge, had expected. My client has absolutely nothing, my stepfather said loudly, his voice echoing through the courtroom. No money, no assets, no future. Frankly, Your Honor, he's worth nothing. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the gallery seats behind him. My name is Ethan Carter. Until that moment, I had spent most of my life being told exactly what my stepfather had just said, that I was nothing, that I would always be nothing. And according to the way things looked right now, he was winning. My stepfather, Richard Langford, stood confidently beside his expensive lawyer, wearing the same smug expression he had used for years whenever he talked about me. Richard had married my mother when I was 10. From that day forward, he made it clear that I was just a burden he had been forced to tolerate. You should be grateful I even let you stay in my house, he used to say. I learned early that arguing with him only made things worse, so I stayed quiet, I studied, I worked, and I waited across the courtroom. Richard's lawyer adjusted his glasses and continued speaking to the judge. Your Honor, my client built Langford Logistics from the ground up, he said smoothly. Meanwhile, the young man sitting across from us has contributed absolutely nothing to that company. Richard nodded proudly beside him. That's correct. I sat silently at the defendant's table. My worn suit jacket felt slightly too tight across my shoulders, but it was the best one I owned. My lawyer, Melissa Grant, leaned slightly toward me. Don't react, she whispered. I nodded. I had already learned something important about courtrooms. The loudest person in the room wasn't always the one winning. Richard's lawyer continued confidently. For 20 years, Mr. Langford supported this boy despite receiving no effort or respect in return. Richard folded his arms. Exactly. Behind him, few people whispered among themselves. They didn't know the full story. They only saw what Richard wanted them to see. A successful businessman, struggling stepson trying to claim something he didn't deserve. The judge finally looked down at the documents on his desk. Mr. Langford, he said calmly, your position is that Ethan Carter has no legal claim to your company. Richard didn't hesitate. None. And your testimony is that he never contributed to Langford Logistics. Richard smirked. Not a single thing. The judge nodded slowly. Then he looked toward me for the first time. Mr. Carter, he said. The entire courtroom turned to look. My stepfather's smile widened. He thought this was the moment I would finally be humiliated. The moment the judge would confirm what he had been saying my entire life. Worthless. The judge adjusted his glasses slightly. Is there anything you would like to say before the court reviews the final documents? My lawyer glanced at me carefully. I took a slow breath. Then I stood. For a moment, I looked across the courtroom at Richard Langford, the man who had spent years convincing everyone that I was nothing. Then I said something simple. Yes, Your Honor. The room grew quiet. Richard leaned back in his chair confidently. He thought he already knew what I was going to say. But what he didn't know was that the judge hadn't looked at me out of pity. He had looked at me because of something written in the final document sitting on his desk. Something Richard Langford had never bothered to read, and in less than a minute, the judge was about to say my name in a way that would change everything. Asterisk, asterisk, the courtroom remained silent as I stood there. Every pair of eyes fixed on me. For years I had imagined what this moment might feel like, standing across from Richard Langford, the man who had spent half my life reminding me that I was nothing. But strangely, I didn't feel angry. I felt calm. Judge Harold Whitman looked at me patiently from the bench. Go ahead, Mr. Carter, he said. Across the aisle, Richard leaned back in his chair with the same confident smirk he always wore whenever he thought he had already won. This should be entertaining, he muttered loud enough for several people to hear. A few quiet laughs echoed behind him. My lawyer, Melissa Grant, leaned slightly closer. Just tell the truth, she whispered. I nodded. Then I looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, began calmly. My stepfather is correct about one thing. Richard raised an eyebrow. Oh, this should be good, he said. I continued. I never owned any shares of Langford Logistics. Richard's smile grew wider. See, he said to his lawyer. But I hadn't finished speaking, and I never asked for ownership, I added. The judge tilted his head slightly. Then why are we here today, Mr. Carter? That was the question everyone in the room wanted answered. Why would someone fight a legal battle over a company they didn't own? Richard laughed under his breath, because he thinks he deserves something he didn't earn. I ignored him. Your Honor, I said. 20 years ago, my mother passed away. The courtroom grew quieter. The judge nodded slowly. Yes, I see that in the record. My mother worked with my stepfather when he first started his company. I continued. Richard shifted in his seat. She helped with basic paperwork, he interrupted. Nothing important. Melissa immediately stood. Your Honor, the witness should allow Mr. Carter to finish. Judge Whitman nodded. Continue. I took a slow breath. When my mother became sick, she spent her final months preparing something.
Richard
rolled his eyes. Here we go. But the judge was watching me carefully now. What did she prepare? I gestured toward the stack of documents sitting on the judge's desk. That, the courtroom murmured quietly. Judge Whitman picked up the folder again. Richard leaned toward his lawyer. This is pointless, he whispered. But the judge had already opened the document. He began reading it first. His expression didn't change, but then something in the text made his eyebrows lift slightly. Richard noticed immediately. What is it? He asked impatiently. The judge didn't answer. He turned another page, then another. The room felt heavier with every second of silence. Finally, Judge Whitman looked up. Mr. Langford, he said slowly. Richard straightened in his chair. Yes, Your Honor. The judge tapped the document lightly with his finger. This appears to be a legally notarized agreement dated 21 years ago. Richard shrugged. So, the judge looked at him carefully. It lists 2 founding partners. Richard frowned. That's impossible. Judge Whitman read the first name. Richard Langford. Richard nodded proudly. Exactly. And the judge read the second name, and the entire courtroom went quiet. Sarah Carter. Richard blinked. What? The judge continued reading. This document states that Sarah Carter vested her inheritance into the creation of Langford Logistics. Richard's face began to pale. That's not the judge. Raised his hand slightly. There's more. Flip to the next page. This agreement also states that if Sarah Carter were to pass away, he paused, then looked directly at me. Her ownership stake would transfer to her legal heir. The courtroom felt like it had stopped breathing. Richard's voice cracked slightly. That's ridiculous. The judge finally said the words that changed everything. According to this document, Mr. Carter, he paused. You inherited 50% of Langford Logistics. Richard shot to his feet. That's impossible. The judge wasn't finished, because the next page in the folder contained something that made even him pause. And when he read it, he slowly looked at me again, this time, not with curiosity, but with something very different. Respect. The courtroom exploded into whispers the moment the judge finished speaking. Even the court clerk looked up in surprise. Across the aisle, Richard Langford stood frozen beside his lawyer, staring at the document like it had suddenly betrayed him. That's not real, he said quickly. That document is fake. Judge Harold Whitman didn't react. Instead, he calmly turned another page in the file. This agreement appears to be notarized by a licensed attorney, the judge said. And it was filed with the county registry 21 years ago. Richard's lawyer leaned over immediately. Your Honor, may I see the document? The judge handed it down. The lawyer scanned the page quickly. Then his confident expression began to fade. This? He muttered quietly. Richard frowned. What? The lawyer lowered the paper slightly. The notarization is legitimate. Richard stared at him. You're joking. No. The lawyer flipped to the second page, then the third. Every signature, every legal stamp, every verification. All real, Richard. felt a cold tension spreading through his chest. This doesn't make sense, he said. Across the courtroom, I remained standing calmly, for the first time since the hearing began. The people in the gallery were no longer looking at me with pity. Now they were looking at Richard. Judge Whitman folded his hands. "Together, Mr. Langford," he said. Richard turned back toward the bench. "Yes. Did your late wife contribute financially to the creation of your company?" Richard hesitated. His lawyer looked at him carefully. Finally, Richard spoke. "Yes," the courtroom murmured again. "But it wasn't much," he added quickly. The judge glanced back at the document. "According to this agreement, Sarah Carter invested $200,000. Several people in the gallery gasped quietly. 21 years ago. That amount was enormous. Richard shifted uncomfortably. "She insisted on helping," he said defensively. And in return, the judge continued, "she received a 50% ownership stake in Langford Logistics." Richard's jaw tightened. "That was just paperwork." Judge Whitman raised an eyebrow. "Legally binding paperwork." Richard didn't answer. The judge turned toward me. "Mr. Carter, were you aware of this document before today?" "Yes, Your Honor." The judge leaned slightly forward. "When did you discover it?" I took a breath. 3 months ago." Richard spun around, toward me. "You knew about this?"
What?
"I must have." "Anything earlier?" I looked at him calmly. "You never asked?" Few quiet chuckles spread through the gallery seats. Richard slammed his hand on the table. "This is absurd." But the judge raised his hand for silence. "Mr. Langford, please control yourself." Richard forced himself to sit back down. His lawyer leaned close to him. "You should stop talking," he whispered urgently. But Richard was too furious to listen. "This boy never worked a day in my company," he snapped. The judge nodded slowly. "That may be true." Richard smirked again. "Exactly," the judge continued. "However, ownership is not determined by employment." Richard's smile disappeared. The judge tapped the document again. "It is determined by legal agreements." The room fell silent once more. Richard's lawyer rubbed his forehead. "This changes things," he muttered. Richard glared at him. "How?" Lawyer lowered his voice. "If this document holds up," he hesitated, "your stepson legally owns half the company." Richard's breathing grew heavier. "That's impossible." But the judge wasn't finished reading. He turned to the final page in the folder. Then he paused. Richard noticed. "What now?" he asked. The judge looked back at me again. "Mr. Carter." "Yes, Your Honor." "This document also includes a clause that I find unusual." The room grew tense. "What clause?" Richard demanded. The judge read directly from the page. "In the event that the surviving partner attempts to deny or conceal the ownership transfer," he paused, "the heir will be granted full authority to request a financial audit of the company." Richard's stomach dropped. "What?" The judge looked directly at him, and according to this filing, he flipped one final sheet in the folder. "Mr. Carter has already submitted that request." Richard felt his chest tighten. "You audited my company." I met his eyes calmly. "Yes." The judge nodded slowly. "The results of that audit are included in this file." Richard's lawyer leaned forward quickly. "Your Honor, may I review that section?" The judge handed him the pages. The lawyer read them. His face turned pale. Richard noticed immediately. "What is it?" The lawyer looked up slowly. "Richard," his voice sounded different now. "There's a serious problem." Richard frowned. "What?" "Problem," the lawyer swallowed. "The audit found $20 million missing from company accounts." The courtroom erupted into shocked whispers, but the biggest shock of all, Still on the next page the judge had not yet read. Asterisk, asterisk, the courtroom erupted with whispers the moment the lawyer finished speaking. $20 million? People in the gallery leaned forward, trying to hear every word at the defendant's table. Richard Langford looked like someone had just pulled the ground out from under him. That's ridiculous, he snapped.
My accounts are perfectly
Clean. His lawyer didn't look so confident anymore. He flipped through the audit pages again, reading them carefully. Richard? He said quietly. Richard leaned closer. What? The lawyer lowered his voice. These numbers, they don't match the financial reports your company filed last year. Richard's jaw tightened. Across the courtroom, I remained completely calm. Judge Harold Whitman leaned forward slightly. Counselor, he said, are you suggesting the audit may be accurate? The lawyer hesitated. I'm saying we need to examine this more closely. The judge nodded slowly. Very well. He turned toward the documents again. This audit was conducted by an independent financial investigation firm. Richard scoffed. So, the judge continued reading. The investigators report that approximately $20 million was moved through a series of shell accounts over the past 4 years. A woman in the back of the courtroom gasped. Richard's voice rose. That's impossible. The judge raised his hand. Mr. Langford, please remain seated. But Richard was already standing again. This entire thing is a setup. Judge Whitman's voice grew firmer. Sit down. After a tense moment, Richard reluctantly sat. The judge turned another page. The report also identifies the account used for the transfers. Richard laughed nervously. Good. Then you'll see I had nothing to do with it. But the judge didn't smile. Instead, he read the account name aloud. Langford Executive Operations. Richard froze. That's just a company account, he said quickly. The judge nodded. Double quotes. Yes. Then he looked directly at Richard. And according to the bank records, you are the only person with authorization to access it. The courtroom fell silent again. Richard's lawyer slowly closed the audit file. Richard, he whispered. Richard shook his head. No. Judge Whitman tapped the document slightly. The transfers began 3 years ago. Richard's voice grew defensive. I move money between accounts all the time. That's normal business. Judge nodded again. Moving company funds is normal. He paused. But transferring them into personal offshore accounts is not. Several people in the gallery gasped. Richard's face turned pale. That's not what happened. The judge slid another page forward. This is the transaction record from one of those offshore accounts. Richard's lawyer leaned forward quickly. He read the document. Then he slowly sat back in his chair. This is bad, he muttered. Richard glared at him. Stop saying that. But the lawyer looked at the judge. Your Honor, we may need to request a recess. Judge Whitman shook his head. I don't believe that will be necessary. He lifted the eye. Final sheet from the audit report. This document contains the full trace of the missing funds. Richard felt his stomach tighten. The judge looked up, double quotes, Mr. Carter. Yes, Your Honor. Did you personally initiate this audit? Yes, and why did you decide to do that? I answered calmly. Because 3 months ago I discovered that someone was draining money from the company my mother helped. Richard slammed his fist on the table. You're lying. Judge Whitman's voice cut through the room. Mr. Langford. Richard froze. That will be enough. The judge placed the final document on the bench. The evidence suggests that the funds were transferred through 12 separate accounts before arriving at their final destination. Richard swallowed. And where exactly is that? Judge Whitman read the final line. A private trust account registered in the Cayman Islands. Richard forced out a laugh. That proves nothing. The judge looked at him calmly. You're right. Richard leaned back in his chair with relief. But then the judge finished his sentence. On its own, it proves nothing. He lifted another page. But this does. Richard's relief vanished instantly. What is that? Document. This is the ownership certificate of that offshore trust. The room felt like it stopped breathing. Richard whispered nervously, and the judge read the name printed on the certificate. Then he looked directly at Richard. The trust belongs to you." A stunned silence swept through the courtroom, and for the first time since the hearing began, Richard Langford had no answer. The silence inside the courtroom felt heavier than anything that had happened so far. For the first time since the hearing began, Richard Langford didn't have a quick response ready. He simply sat there staring at the document in the judge's hand as if refusing to believe what it said. "That's not mine," he said finally. Judge Harold Whitman didn't look convinced. "The trust registration includes your signature." Richard shook his head quickly. That signature could be forged. His lawyer leaned closer, took the paper from the judge's clerk. He examined it carefully. Then he flipped to the second page. And the third. Richard watched him nervously. "Well?" he demanded. The lawyer sighed. "It's verified." Richard's face went pale. "That's impossible." Across the room, quiet murmurs spread through the gallery again. Only an hour earlier, everyone in that courtroom had believed the story Richard was telling. Now the entire narrative had flipped. Judge Whitman leaned back slightly in his chair. "Mr. Langford," he said calmly, "do you still maintain that you had no involvement in the missing funds?" Richard forced himself to stand. "Yes." The word came out too quickly. "My company handles millions of dollars every year. There are dozens of people with access to those systems." The judge raised an eyebrow. "The audit report says otherwise." Richard turned toward me suddenly. "This was his plan," he snapped. "He fabricated this entire thing to steal my company." I didn't react. Judge Whitman spoke again. "Mr. Carter, when you initiated the audit, were you aware that the investigation might uncover criminal activity?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Why did you proceed anyway?" I answered quietly. "Because it wasn't just my stepfather's company." The judge nodded slowly. "You believed the business partly belonged to you." "Yes." Richard laughed bitterly. "Listen to him. He's been waiting 20 years for this." The judge glanced at the documents again. "Actually, according to these records, the situation may be far more serious than a civil ownership dispute." Richard's lawyer immediately looked uneasy. "What do you mean, Your Honor?" Judge Whitman tapped the audit report. "The investigators didn't just trace the missing funds." He turned another page. "They also traced the original source of those funds." Richard frowned. "What are you talking about?" The judge read, directly from the report, "The first unauthorized transfer occurred 4 years ago." Richard's lawyer's expression changed instantly. "For years." The judge nodded. Double quotes. "Yes." The lawyer slowly lowered the document. "Richard, that's before the expansion project." Richard looked confused. "So," the lawyer swallowed, "the expansion project was funded by investors." Richard's chest tightened. "What does that have to do with anything?" The lawyer pointed at the audit report. "These funds were moved from the investor capital accounts." The courtroom erupted into shocked whispers. Richard shook his head. "That's not true." Judge Whitman's voice remained calm. "The financial investigators confirmed that $20 million originally belonging to private investors was redirected through company accounts before arriving in the offshore trust." Richard's breathing grew heavier. "That's a mistake." The judge didn't look convinced. "Mr. Langford, do you understand what that implies?" Richard's voice cracked slightly. "No." The judge folded his hands together. "It implies that the missing funds were not simply company money." The courtroom fell silent again. The judge continued. "They were investor funds." Richard's lawyer closed his eyes briefly. "Oh no." Richard stared at him. "What?" The lawyer looked at the judge slowly. "Your Honor, if that's accurate." He hesitated. "This isn't just a civil case anymore." The judge nodded. "That's correct." Richard's stomach dropped. "What are you saying?" The judge's voice was calm but firm. "I'm saying that if the evidence confirms these transfers—" He paused. "Investigation." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "That's ridiculous." But at that exact moment, the courtroom doors opened. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, and behind them stood a man wearing a dark suit with a small badge clipped to his jacket. Judge Whitman glanced toward the door. Then he said something that made the entire room Go silent again. Perfect timing. Richard turned slowly toward the new arrival, and when the man stepped forward, he introduced himself with 3 words that made Richard's hands begin to shake. Federal Financial Crimes Division. Asterisk, asterisk, the moment the man stepped into the courtroom, the atmosphere changed instantly. Even the quiet whispers from the gallery stopped. The man walked calmly toward the front of the room, his polished shoes echoing softly across the marble floor. He stopped beside the officers and nodded respectfully to the judge. Special Agent Daniel Hayes. Federal Financial Crimes Division. Judge Harold Whitman acknowledged him with a small nod. Agent Hayes, thank you for coming so quickly.
Cross.
The courtroom, Richard Langford, felt his throat tighten. What is this? He demanded. Agent Hayes turned toward him calmly. Mr. Langford, we received a request from the court to review financial evidence related to Langford Logistics. Richard forced out a nervous laugh. This is a business dispute, not a federal. Case Agent Hayes didn't smile. That depends. He stepped closer to the evidence table where the audit documents were spread out. May I? The judge gestured toward the files. Of course. Hayes began reviewing the papers quietly. Each page he turned seemed to stretch the tension. Inside the courtroom a little further, finally he stopped on the transaction summary. $20 million, he said. Richard crossed his arms. That number is completely fabricated. Agent Hayes ignored the comment. These transfers were routed through 12 accounts before reaching an offshore trust. He looked up. That's a classic laundering structure. Richard's lawyer leaned forward nervously. Agent Hayes, my client denies any involvement. Hayes nodded. I'm sure he does. Then he flipped to the final page of the audit report. The ownership certificate of the offshore trust. Hayes studied it carefully. Then he looked directly at Richard. This trust belongs to you. Richard immediately shook his head. No, Hayes raised an eyebrow. You're denying ownership? Yes. Hayes glanced at the signature on the certificate. Because according to this record, you signed the trust registration 4 years ago. Richard felt sweat forming on his forehead. That signature was forged. Hayes nodded slowly. That's possible. Richard looked relieved for a moment, but then Hayes continued. That's why we already verified it. The courtroom went silent again. Richard's voice dropped. Verified how? Hayes reached into his briefcase and removed another folder. Through biometric signature analysis, Richard stared at him, and Hayes placed the report on the table. It's authentic. Richard's lawyer covered his face briefly with his hand. This keeps getting worse, he muttered. Judge Whitman leaned forward slightly. Agent Hayes, do these financial transfers meet the threshold for federal investigation? Hayes nodded without hesitation. Yes. Richard shook his head. This is insane. Hayes continued calmly. The funds were taken from investor capital accounts and moved across international financial networks. He paused. That's interstate. Financial fraud and international money laundering. The words landed like a hammer. Richard whispered. That's impossible. Hayes looked at him carefully. Mr. Langford, do you have any explanation for why $20 million ended up in a trust account registered under your name? Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. Across the room, the gallery sat in stunned silence. Only one person remained, completely calm. Agent Hayes noticed. He turned toward the judge again. Your Honor, based on the evidence presented, here we are prepared to open a formal federal investigation. Richard's heart began pounding faster. Investigation? He said. Hayes nodded. Yes, Richard laughed nervously. You don't have enough evidence for that? Hayes met his eyes. Actually, we do. Richard frowned. What evidence? Hayes slowly turned the final page of the report. Because the audit didn't just trace the money. He paused. It also traced who authorized the transfers. Richard's stomach dropped. And according to the company's internal server logs, Hayes looked directly at him. Every transfer was approved using your personal login credentials. Richard shot to his feet. That proves nothing. But Hayes wasn't finished, especially since the security system that recorded those logs, he glanced toward me, was designed by Mr. Carter. Every head in the courtroom turned toward me again. For the first time that day, Agent Hayes studied me carefully. "You're the one who built the tracking system?" "Yes." Hayes nodded slowly. "Impressive work." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "This is a conspiracy." But Hayes spoke calmly. "No, Mr. Langford." He signaled the officers standing near the door. "This is an arrest." The officers stepped forward, and for the first time in his life, Richard Langford realized he was about to lose everything. The moment the officers stepped forward, the entire courtroom erupted into shocked whispers. For years, Richard Langford had walked into rooms like he owned them. Wealthy investors respected him, employees feared him, and business partners treated him like a man who could never lose. But now 2 uniformed officers stood on either side of him. And for the first time, Richard looked small. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, trying to pull his arm away as one of the officers reached for him. "You can't arrest me based on paperwork." Special Agent Daniel Hayes stepped forward calmly. "It's not just paperwork." Richard glared at him. "Then what is it?" Hayes opened the evidence folder again. Server logs, financial transfers, biometric signatures, and audit records. He closed the folder slowly. "That's more than enough for probable cause." Richard's lawyer stood quickly. Agent Hayes. "My client has the right to Hayes," raised his hand. "Your client will have the opportunity to defend himself." Then he nodded toward the officers. "Go ahead." The sound of metal cuffs clicking around Richard's wrists echoed through the courtroom. A woman in the gallery gasped. Richard looked around the room wildly. "You're all making a mistake." But no one moved to help him. Judge Harold Whitman watched quietly from the bench. Across the room, I remained standing beside my lawyer. For a long moment, Richard stared directly at me. "This is what you wanted," he said bitterly. I shook my head slowly. "No." Richard laughed angrily. "You destroyed me." My voice stayed calm. "You destroyed yourself." The officers began escorting him toward the courtroom doors. But just before they reached them, the judge spoke again. "Mr. Langford." Richard turned around. "Yes." Judge Whitman looked at him carefully. "There is still the matter of Langford Logistics." Richard frowned. "What about it?" The judge tapped the document on his desk. "The ownership agreement." Richard's face tightened. The judge continued. "According to the legally binding contract signed by your late wife," he paused. "Mr. Ethan Carter owns 50% of the company." Richard clenched his fists inside the handcuffs. "That document shouldn't exist." But the judge continued. "And due to the financial misconduct uncovered in this hearing," he flipped one more page in the file, "the court has authorized a temporary freeze on your executive authority." The room fell silent. Richard whispered slowly. "What does that mean?" The judge looked toward me. "It means Mr. Carter will assume interim control of Langford Logistics while the investigation continues." The gallery erupted with whispers again. Richard stared at me like he had just heard the impossible. "You." Didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I simply stood there, because for years, Richard had told everyone I was worthless. Now the judge had just handed me control of the company he built. Richard shook his head in disbelief. "This is insane." The officers pulled him toward the door again. But before he was taken out of the courtroom, he looked at me one last time. "You think you won?" he said. I met his eyes calmly. This was never about winning. The courtroom doors opened, and Richard Langford disappeared into the hallway. For the first time in 20 years, the courtroom was quiet. Judge Whitman looked down at me again. "Mr. Carter." "Yes, Your Honor." Adjusted his glasses. "I have one final question." "Yes. When you discovered the fraud, why did you bring the evidence too?" "Court, instead of keeping the company for yourself." The entire room waited for my answer. I thought about my mother for a moment. Then I said something simple, because she built it honestly. The judge nodded slowly. Then he said the words that officially ended the case. "Court is adjourned." But what happened after the courtroom emptied was something no one expected. Asterisk, asterisk, the courtroom slowly began to empty. After the judge's gavel echoed through the room, lawyers gathered their files. Reporters whispered to each other near the hallway. Investors who had been sitting quietly in the back rows rushed toward the exit, already making phone calls about what had just happened. Only a few people remained inside. My lawyer, Melissa Grant, closed the case folder and looked at me with a small smile. "Well," she said softly, "that's not how I expected this morning to go." I let out a quiet breath. "Me neither." Across the room, Special Agent Daniel Hayes was speaking to two officers before preparing to leave. As he passed our table, he stopped briefly. "You did the right thing," he said. Melissa nodded. Double quotes. His system helped uncover the entire fraud trail. Hayes looked back at me. "That security platform you built?" "Yes, it's impressive." I shrugged slightly. "Just doing my job." Hayes smiled faintly. "You might be doing a lot more than that soon." Then he left the courtroom. For a moment, the room fell quiet again. Melissa turned toward me. "So how does it feel?" "What?" Gestured toward the documents still sitting on the table. "You now control half of a multi-million-dollar logistics company." I looked down at the paper's ownership. Agreements, financial reports, audit results, all the things that had turned my life upside down in the last 2 hours. "It doesn't feel real yet," I admitted. Melissa laughed softly. "That's normal." Then she added something more serious. "But there's something else you should know." I looked at her. "What?" She slid another document across the table. This came from the investors. I read the heading. "Emergency Board Meeting Resolution." "What is this?" I asked. Melissa leaned back slightly after hearing what happened in court today. The investors held a quick vote. My stomach tightened, and Melissa smiled. "They removed Richard Langford as CEO." I blinked. "That was fast." She nodded. "They didn't want their money connected to a fraud investigation." I looked down at the next line in the document. Then I stopped reading. Melissa watched my reaction carefully. "You see it?" I nodded slowly, because the next sentence said something I never expected to read. "The board unanimously appoints Ethan Carter as acting chief executive officer of Langford Logistics." For a moment, I just stared at the words. 20 years of being told I was worthless. 20 years of hearing that I would never become anything. And now, the same company I had supposedly never contributed to had just made me its CEO. Melissa smiled. "Congratulations." I leaned back in the chair, still trying to process it. "This is insane." Melissa shrugged. "Life works in strange ways." A few minutes later, we stepped outside the courthouse. The afternoon sun was bright. Reporters were already gathering near the front steps, waiting for a statement. Melissa looked at me. "Ready?" I shook my head slightly. "Not really," she laughed. "You'll get used to it." Across the street, a news van pulled up. Cameras turned toward the courthouse entrance. And suddenly it hit me. Everything was about to change. But as I stood there, looking back at the courthouse doors, one thought crossed my mind. My stepfather had spent years telling me I was worth nothing. Today a judge, courtroom full of people, and an entire company board had just proven something very different. Sometimes, the people who call you worthless are simply afraid of what you might become.